Worries in toxic chemicals in processed food has been a hot button issue for some time now in the media, and since most of the information surrounding chemicals in food is relatively new, it is unknown about some of the long-term effects of using these chemicals. The United States government has put into place many different programs that monitor the effects of using chemicals in mass production food. Some of these programs include the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Even with all these precautions in place, there has still been a problem with the food industry using non-approved levels of certain chemicals and taking advantage of the general public, or hiding or changing names of certain chemical ingredients on their packaging. This lack of transparency has led to many different health problems, the worsening of existing health problems, and many different issues in the public. Today I will be discussing the United States drinking water systems, the food packaging industry, and how the lack of overseeing these toxic chemicals have affected the public health. In the United States, we have different systems of running water that allow us all to have safe drinking water and water for everyday use. This network of water processing is called public water systems. These were brought around in the 1970s with the Safe Drinking Water Act, or the SDWA. This made the research for the safety of public drinking water a responsibility of the American government, and the method in which public drinking water was processed also a governmental responsibility. So let's break down these public water systems down to see why some issues have been arising. First, these water systems are broken into districts, and each district has a different processing center that cleans and filtrates water that is distributed to people's homes. Unlike some utilities, water is done purely through the local government to ensure transparency and not dealing with privatized business. These districts are monitored by the EPA to ensure the water is safe to drink and the level of any present chemicals is within legal thresholds. The EPA checks for the presence of microorganisms, disinfectants, disinfectant byproducts, inorganic chemicals, organic chemicals, and radionuclides. While some of these are natural to find in drinking water, the EPA has set safety regulations to limit the amount of chemicals that can be present without causing any harm. The EPA regularly tests drinking water based on the requirements set forth by the Safe Drinking Water Act. Areas with multiple counts of violations have to be monitored very closely, and adversely, areas with lower accounts of violations have longer time gaps in their testing. A public water system must notify its customers when it violates drinking water regulations or is providing drinking water that may pose a health risk. Such notifications are provided either immediately or as soon as possible, but within 30 days of the violation notice, or annually, depending on the health risks of the situation with the violation. These reports identify contaminants, if any, in drinking water and explain potential health impacts. The SDWA requires the EPA to identify and list unregulated contaminants which require regulation. This agency must publish this list called the Contaminant Candidate List, or the CCL, every 5 years. The EPA is required to decide whether to regulate at least 5 or more of the listed contaminants. The EPA uses this list to prioritize research and data collection efforts. Which support the regulatory determination process. While we have the EPA to monitor our water systems, we also have the FDA, or the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, to monitor food and pharmaceutical drug production. The Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, is responsible for assuring that foods sold in the U.S. are safe, wholesome, and properly labeled. This applies to foods produced domestically as well as foods from foreign countries. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FD&C Act, and the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act are federal laws governing food production under the FDA's jurisdiction. A study done by the Environmental Management Institute in Indianapolis showed that gaps in testing is to the fault of the FDA and the EPA, and how this lack of testing is leading to. This study uses the presence of different substances in common grocery store foods to see if it is harmful to the public. Safe substances by the FDA means that there is a reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that these substances are not harmful under the intended conditions of use. In their studies, there are over 400 chemicals that were outside the regulations of the FDA, and these chemicals have shown to have health consequences if there is a buildup in the body. However, since the FDA is not regulating these substances with proper toxicology testing, many of these chemicals do not have a regulatory amount that is safe for consumption. and the FDA can't prove within a reasonable doubt that these substances additives won't have effect on the population. The FDA sets limits to these chemicals that are allowed in food production. However, the enforcement of these regulations has been a huge issue. Unfortunately, nutrition fact labels are not always factual. For starters, the law allows a pretty lax margin of error, up to 20%, for the started value versus the actual value in the nutrients. In reality, that means a 100-calorie pack could theoretically contain up to 120 calories and still be not violating the law. The same margin of error goes for other nutrients as well, which doesn't bode well for diabetic carb counters, folks with high blood pressure who are watching sodium intake, or the moms trying to look out for the iron content for their babies. The FDA has never established a systematic random labeling audit process, and compliance with these laws is left up to be self-enforced by the food manufacturers themselves. The unstudied toxic chemicals have caused many problems for the new generation of children and are only projected to increase with the growing rates of industrialization continuing to rise. Toxic chemicals have worked their way into agricultural processes such as the water systems, pesticides, chemical fertilizers, and injective copious numbers of hormones in livestock. With such a high volume of production, the US government has left certain things without proper testing. In conclusion, scientists have been bridging the gaps that the FDA and the EPA and other programs like that have been missing in terms of their testing. And these independent studies have been the reasons bills and laws have been enacted or modified in order to keep the public aware of these harmful chemicals in food. The purpose of my presentation was to keep everyone informed about the harmful effects of toxic chemicals in food. The goal is to keep everyone aware and have a transparency in what food they are putting in their bodies. The food packaging industry has failed to properly label their products. This has led to many health complications across America. Make sure you are doing your research before you buy a pre-packaged product. There are many things that are hidden under different names or not presented by the manufacturer. And if you have any concerns, make sure to contact your local representatives to bring attention to your local area. Thank you.